The History of Everything You Use, Episode 9. Beer and Wine, Humanity's Oldest Companions. Opening. Welcome back. Tonight we continue our slow journey through the histories of the ordinary things that fill our days. We have followed salt, coffee, sugar, bread, tea, spices, chocolate, and the small metal tools with which we lift them all to our mouths. Tonight, we turn to two liquids that predate almost everything else we have discussed in this series. Liquids that our ancestors were making, drinking, and worshipping long before they built the first cities, long before they invented writing, perhaps even before they domesticated the first grain. They sit, right now, in bottles and cans and casks, in shops and cellars across the world. A golden pint of beer, crowned with white foam. A ruby glass of wine, catching the light of an evening lamp. In modern life, they are so ordinary that we forget how strange they are. Because both of them are, in the plainest chemical sense, a kind of controlled decay. Fruit that has spoiled. Grain that has been left too long in warm water. Sugars broken down by tiny fungi, which release, as a waste product, a compound that alters the human mind. And yet, these accidents of decay have shaped human civilization more deeply than almost anything else. They gave us gods and rituals. They gave us hospitality and songs. They gave us monasteries and universities. They gave us the taverns where revolutions were plotted, and the vineyards that carved the landscape of half a continent. Some archaeologists now argue, quite seriously, that human beings may have first begun farming grain not to eat it as bread, but to ferment it into beer. Tonight, we are going to talk about beer and wine. So settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift back with mine through Sumerian temples and Egyptian breweries, through Greek symposia and Roman vineyards, through Belgian monasteries and Bordeaux merchant houses, through Prohibition-era speakeasies and the quiet dinner tables of every ordinary evening, to a time when the discovery that grain and grape could be transformed by patience and warmth was one of the most important discoveries our species had ever made. Part 1. Older than bread. We must begin with something surprising. The oldest evidence we currently have for alcoholic fermentation by human beings is not from the great river civilizations of Mesopotamia or Egypt. It is not even from the Neolithic villages of the Fertile Crescent, though those play a large role in the story. The oldest evidence is much older than that. In 2018, archaeologists working at a site called Rakfet Cave, in what is today northern Israel, published a startling finding. In stone mortars carved into the cave floor, they had identified residues consistent with beer production from a Natufian culture site dating to roughly 13,000 years ago. The Natufians were the very same people we discussed in our episode on bread, semi-settled hunter-gatherers of the Levant on the very edge of the great transition to agriculture. And it now appears that alongside the earliest flatbreads we discussed then, these people were also brewing a rough, low-alcohol beer, most likely for use in ritual feasts around the burial of the dead. Think about this. Beer, in some form, may be older than farming, older than settled villages, older than pottery. As old, in fact, as the earliest human experiments with cultivating wild grain at all. And this raises a fascinating question that archaeologists have debated for decades. Did our ancestors begin cultivating grain because they wanted bread, or because they wanted beer? The evidence is genuinely uncertain, and the answer is probably both. But we should sit with the possibility that alcohol, not food, may have been part of what pulled human beings into agriculture. That the first fields of wheat and barley were sown, in part, because someone had discovered that the seeds of these grasses, soaked in water and left in the sun, produced a drink that made a hard life easier to bear and a celebration more joyful. Wine came a little later, or at least the evidence for it does. The oldest confirmed traces of grape wine come from clay jars found in the Republic of Georgia in the southern Caucasus, dating to around 6000 BC, 8,000 years ago. Chemical analysis of the residue inside these jars shows the compounds that indicate fermented grape juice. Wine's homeland, in the current archaeological picture, is that ancient hilly country where Georgia meets Armenia, Turkey, and Iran, a landscape where wild grapes still grow in profusion, and where our ancestors first noticed that fruit left in a pot did something remarkable. From these origins, both drinks spread, and by the time we reach the age of the earliest cities, they were already central to civilization. Part 2. The Sumerian Goddess of Beer. In the great river cities of ancient Mesopotamia, Ur, Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, and their sisters, beer was not merely a drink. It was a foundation of society, a daily ration, a currency, a medicine, and a gift to the gods. Beer in ancient Sumer was very different from the clear, filtered lager we drink today. It was thick, cloudy, and full of the residues of unfiltered grain. It was often drunk not from a cup, but through a long straw of reed or metal, so that the drinker could reach past the floating debris of grain husks to the liquid below. Cylinder seals and carved reliefs show pairs of Sumerian drinkers seated across from one another, each sipping from a communal jar through a long straw. An image so distinctive that once you have seen it, you cannot forget it. And beer was quite literally sacred. The Sumerians honoured a goddess named Ninkasi, the lady who fills the mouth, as the divine patroness of brewing. Around 1800 BC, on a clay tablet from Nippur, a scribe recorded a hymn to her. This hymn, which we still have, is essentially a prayer, a praise song, and, remarkably, a brewing recipe. Line by line, it describes how the malted grain is soaked, how the loaves of bread malt are baked, how the mash is spread on reed mats, how the wort is filtered into fermentation vessels. It ends with an image of the finished beer flowing like the surging Tigris and Euphrates, and of the drinkers made happy and blessed. This is one of the oldest surviving pieces of technical writing in the world, and it is a beer recipe embedded in a hymn to a goddess. That tells us everything about how the Sumerians understood their drink. Modern craft brewers have used the hymn to Ninkasi, together with careful archaeological and botanical work, to attempt to recreate Sumerian beer. The results, by most accounts, are drinkable but strange. A sour, slightly sweet, cloudy brew, unlike anything sold in a modern liquor store. And it was everywhere. Sumerian and Babylonian workers were paid, in part, in beer. Standard rations of grain were partly transformed by brewing. The Great Law Code of Hammurabi, from around 1750 BC, contains regulations for taverns, for the price of beer, for the honesty of tavern keepers, for the punishment of those who diluted their drinks. Hammurabi's laws punished a dishonest tavern keeper by drowning. A society that punishes short-measured beer with capital punishment is a society that takes beer very seriously. Part 3. The Egyptian Brewery. The tradition passed south along the great trade routes to Egypt, where beer took on much the same central role. Egyptian beer, called hekt or heket, was produced on an industrial scale. Recent excavations at the ancient Egyptian settlement of Abydos have uncovered what may be the earliest large-scale brewery in the world, a facility from around 3000 BC, at the very dawn of the Egyptian state, capable of producing tens of thousands of litres at a time. Just as we saw in the episode on bread, Egyptian workers on great state projects were paid in bread and beer. The pyramid builders received daily rations of both. Papyrus records from the villages that housed these workers detail the amounts precisely. It is not too much to say that the pyramids of Giza were, in a very literal sense, raised by muscles fueled by bread and beer. Egyptian beer was drunk by everyone, from the poorest labourer to the pharaoh. It was left in tombs as an offering. Egyptian gods received it. Egyptian children drank a mild version of it, because beer, unlike most water in the ancient world, was safe. The process of brewing, especially the boiling of the wort and the acidic environment of fermentation, killed most of the microbes that made untreated water dangerous. In the ancient and medieval world, this was one of beer's greatest and most underrated virtues. It was not simply pleasant, it was safe. In a world where water often killed you, beer kept you alive. Part 4. Wine and the Mediterranean. If Mesopotamia and Egypt were the great beer civilizations of the ancient world, the Mediterranean became the great wine civilization. From the Caucasus, the vine spread west, reaching Anatolia, the Aegean Islands, mainland Greece, and eventually every warm hillside of the Mediterranean basin. Wine was central to Greek life in a way that few substances have been for any culture. The Greeks worshipped Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, madness, and theatre, with rituals that ranged from private household libations to great state festivals. From the worship of Dionysus, remarkably, came Greek tragedy and comedy themselves. The theatre we still study and stage began as ritual performances at the annual Dionysia in Athens. A civilization that traced the origins of drama to a wine god is a civilization that took its wine seriously. And wine was the medium of one of the great social institutions of the ancient Greek world, the symposium. A symposium, the word literally means drinking together, was a formal gathering of male citizens who reclined on couches around a mixing bowl and discussed philosophy, politics, poetry, and love, while slowly working through carefully proportioned wine mixed with water. Plato's dialogue, the Symposium, is set at exactly such a gathering and preserves for us the pattern of Greek intellectual sociability. The Greeks considered drinking undiluted wine to be barbaric, a habit of Scythians and other outsiders. Civilized men drank wine mixed with water in a ratio carefully chosen by the host, and they conversed. The Romans inherited the Greek love of wine and transformed it into an industry. Roman wine production spread across the entire empire. Vineyards were planted in Gaul, in the Iberian Peninsula, along the Danube, on the Rhine. Roman merchants established the trade networks that would, centuries later, become the great wine regions of Europe: Bordeaux, Burgundy, the Mosel, the Rhineland, Rioja. Every one of these regions carries, in its landscape and its viticultural traditions, the fingerprints of Roman planters 2,000 years ago. When you drink a glass of French or German or Spanish wine today, you are drinking the descendant of a Roman commercial calculation. Roman writers were as passionate about wine as the Greeks. Pliny the Elder wrote extensively about grape varieties, terroirs, and vintages. Roman households kept detailed wine cellars, with amphorae labelled by year and vineyard. The great vintages, including the famous Falernian wine from Campania, were bottled, aged for decades, and served with reverence at aristocratic banquets. In a very real sense, the modern practice of wine connoisseurship, of caring about vintages, regions, and grape varieties, begins with Rome. Part 5. The Christian Complication. And then came Christianity, and everything about the relationship between the two drinks began to shift. Christian ritual, from its earliest days, placed wine at the very heart of worship. The Last Supper, in Christian scripture, involves Jesus offering wine to his disciples with the words, "This is my blood." The sacrament of communion, celebrated in almost every Christian tradition, reenacts this moment. Wine, in Christianity, is not just a drink. It is a sacred substance, capable of being transformed into the blood of God himself. This gave wine a religious protection that beer never quite acquired. When Roman civilization collapsed in the West and vine cultivation might have disappeared from many regions, it was preserved by the Church. Monasteries, especially those of the Benedictine order, kept vineyards going through the dark centuries. Monks maintained the arts of grafting, pruning, and fermenting. In some cases, they invented entirely new wine styles. The Cistercians of Burgundy, over generations of patient observation, mapped out the great vineyards of the Côte d'Or, working out which small parcels of hillside produced which subtle differences in wine. The origin of the entire modern French concept of terroir. Champagne, the sparkling wine that has become the ceremonial drink of celebration across the world, was refined at the Abbey of Auvilliers in the 17th century by a monk named Dom Pérignon. The old story that he invented sparkling wine is not quite right. The phenomenon of accidental secondary fermentation was already known, but he worked out crucial techniques for blending and for containing the pressure of the bubbles, and his name has been attached to the drink ever since. And it was not only wine. Monks brewed beer too, and they took it just as seriously. In the medieval and early modern Low Countries, in the Rhineland, in Bavaria, and in what is now Belgium, monasteries produced beers of distinctive character and quality. The Trappist beers of Belgium, Chimay, Vestmaal, Orval, Rochefort, Westvleteren, and their sisters, descend directly from centuries of monastic brewing and are still brewed today by monks within monastery walls. To drink a Trappist beer is to drink a beverage produced by an unbroken chain of religious brewers reaching back many centuries. Meanwhile, in the towns and villages, ordinary people brewed their own beer. In medieval England, most brewing was done by women, the alewives, who fermented barley in their own homes and sold the surplus. The word ale comes from the Old English ealu, an even older word that predates the arrival of the German language influence that gave us beer. For centuries, alewives dominated English brewing until commercial breweries slowly displaced them from the 17th century onward. The image of the witch's tall, pointed hat, some historians have suggested, may derive in part from the traditional tall hat that alewives wore in medieval markets to identify themselves. If this is true, then the visual signature of the Wicked Witch is the ghost of a woman brewer. Part 6. The Great Beer Distinction. Beer, for most of its history, was flavoured with a wildly varying set of herbs and spices. Medieval brewers used gruit, a proprietary mix of bog myrtle, sweet gale, yarrow, and other herbs, which each town or monastery kept as a jealously guarded formula. Beer flavoured with gruit could taste like almost anything. The decisive change came in the late medieval and early modern period, when the plant we now call the hop, a bitter, aromatic climbing vine, began to displace gruit across Northern Europe. Hops did two important things. First, they gave beer a bitter, floral, complex flavour that generations came to love. Second, and even more importantly, they contained natural preservatives that allowed beer to be kept longer without spoiling. This second property changed everything. Unhopped beer had to be drunk fresh, within a few days of brewing. Hopped beer could travel. Hopped beer could be stored. And so, over the 16th and 17th centuries, hopped beer allowed for the rise of commercial brewing on an industrial scale. Cities like Hamburg, Bremen, and Amsterdam became major beer producers. The Dutch and North German invention of hopped beer, and later the German lager tradition of cold fermentation with specific yeast strains, gave the world the modern beer industry. In 1516, the Duke of Bavaria issued a decree that would echo through beer history. The Reinheitsgebot, the German beer purity law, which restricted the ingredients of beer in Bavaria to water, barley, and hops. Yeast was later added once its role was understood. This law, revised and adapted many times, is still cited today as one of the foundations of German brewing culture. Whether it was, in fact, primarily a food safety measure, a tax law, or a protectionist regulation aimed at excluding wheat-based beers is still debated by historians. But its symbolic power is enormous. To this day, when you see a German beer labelled Nach dem Reinheitsgebot gebraut, brewed according to the purity law, you are seeing a piece of medieval Bavarian legislation walking into the 21st century. Part 7. The Age of Great Vineyards. While hopped beer was transforming Northern Europe, the wine regions of France, Italy, Spain, and Portugal were being systematically shaped into the world we still recognise. The great English merchants who purchased Bordeaux wine, a trade that took root because English kings ruled parts of southwestern France in the Middle Ages, developed the classification systems, aging techniques, and international markets that would define wine culture for centuries. Port wine, from the Douro Valley in northern Portugal, was invented largely to survive the sea voyage to England. Its fortification with grape spirit stabilised it against spoilage. Sherry, from Jerez in Andalusia, went through similar processes. The 18th and 19th centuries saw the emergence of the formal French classification of wines. The 1855 Bordeaux classification, drawn up for a Paris exposition at the request of Napoleon III, ranked the great chateaux of Bordeaux into 5 crus, or growths, first growth to fifth growth. That classification, with only one significant change, is still in use today. The wines named as first growths in 1855, Lafite, Latour, Margaux, Haut-Brion, and later Mouton Rothschild, remain more than a century and a half later among the most expensive and prestigious wines in the world. But even as wine became a monument to tradition and hierarchy, it also became increasingly threatened. In the second half of the 19th century, a tiny American aphid called Phylloxera, which fed on grapevine roots, was accidentally introduced to Europe. The results were catastrophic. Phylloxera swept through the vineyards of France, Italy, Spain, and beyond, killing vines by the millions. For a time, it seemed possible that European wine, as it had existed for 2,000 years, might simply die. In the end, the crisis was solved by grafting European vines onto phylloxera-resistant American rootstocks. Almost every fine wine you drink today comes from a vine whose roots are American, a hidden American presence in the deepest French, Italian, and Spanish traditions. Part 8. The American Experiment in Prohibition. The strangest chapter in the modern history of alcohol played out not in Europe, but in the United States. In the late 19th century, a coalition of Protestant churches, women's groups, and social reformers began to argue that alcohol itself, not merely its abuse, was destroying American families and communities. The temperance movement grew into a political force, and on January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution took effect, prohibiting the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors across the entire country. For 13 years, the United States tried and dramatically failed to be a dry nation. Prohibition did reduce overall consumption, at least at first, but it also created something entirely new: a vast underground economy of illegal alcohol production and distribution. Organised crime, which had existed in various forms before, exploded into an industrial-scale enterprise. Figures like Al Capone became wealthy and famous, supplying illegal beer and spirits to speakeasies, the hidden bars that operated in every American city. Corruption of police forces and public officials became epidemic. Rural farmers distilled moonshine in the woods. Urban gangsters imported liquor from Canada and the Caribbean. Ordinary middle-class Americans learned to make wine and beer at home in defiance of the law. By the early 1930s, it was clear that Prohibition had failed. In 1933, the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th, the only time in American history a constitutional amendment has been used to reverse another. The great American experiment in banishing alcohol was over. But its side effects, the empowerment of organized crime, the erosion of respect for federal law, and the destruction of pre-Prohibition American brewing traditions, echoed for decades afterward. The Anheuser-Busch and Miller of the mid-20th century, producing rivers of light industrial lager, replaced a diverse, regional beer culture that had thrived before 1920. Only in the 1970s and 1980s did small American craft brewers begin to rediscover the varieties of beer that Prohibition had erased. Part 9. The Modern Glass. Today, the world drinks more alcohol than at any previous point in history, in absolute terms, although per capita consumption has actually fallen in many wealthy countries over the last several decades, as younger generations drink less than their parents did. Global beer consumption is dominated by industrial lagers, produced by a handful of enormous multinational conglomerates: AB InBev, Heineken, Molson Coors, Asahi, and a few others. And yet, alongside them, an extraordinary craft brewing renaissance has produced tens of thousands of small breweries around the world, reviving old styles, from stout to saison to goza to farmhouse ales, and inventing new ones. Wine has undergone a similar dual transformation. Industrial wine production, especially in Australia, Chile, Argentina, South Africa, and California, has made decent wine affordable to hundreds of millions of new consumers. At the same time, the fine wine market of collectors and connoisseurs has driven prices for the great Bordeaux, Burgundy, and Champagne estates to astonishing levels. Bottles that once sat in aristocratic cellars now sell at auction in Hong Kong and London for the price of a small house. At both ends of the market, the underlying acts remain the same: grain steeped in water and fermented by yeast. Grapes crushed and left in a vessel for their own natural yeasts to work. The oldest technologies of civilization, still with us, still central to how humans mark celebration, sorrow, ritual, and rest. Closing. And so we return, one more time, to the ordinary. To the pint of beer or the glass of wine that, somewhere in the world right now, someone is lifting to their lips. They look so ordinary, so familiar. But you know their secret now. You know that beer, in some form, may be older than farming itself. That it may have been part of the reason our ancestors first sowed grain at all. You know that in ancient Sumer, a scribe wrote a hymn to a goddess that was also a beer recipe, and that Hammurabi's laws punished dishonest tavern keepers with drowning. You know that the pyramids of Egypt were built on rations of bread and beer, and that in the ancient world, weak beer was safer than water and probably kept many children alive. You know that wine is a little younger, that it came from the mountains where Georgia meets Anatolia, and that the Greeks turned drinking it into philosophy and theatre. You know that Christian monks over long, dark centuries kept both vine and grain alive, that Dom Perignon refined champagne in a monastery, that the Trappists still brew beer inside their walls today. You know that hops changed everything, that the Reinheitsgebot of Bavarian dukes still labels beer in the 21st century, and that phylloxera nearly ended European wine forever, saved only by the roots of American vines beneath its noble grapes. And you know that a great American nation once tried to ban alcohol altogether, and produced instead one of the most colourful periods of organised criminality in history. Beer and wine teach us the oldest lesson of this series: that some human companions are much, much older than we imagine. Older than cities, older than writing, older even than agriculture. That the accidents of nature, when they happen to make life more bearable, are treasured for as long as our species exists. And that even a substance as apparently frivolous as a foamy pint or a red glass carries within it, if you look, the whole slow history of how our species learned to celebrate and to grieve and to sit together in the evening. The next time you raise a glass, remember, for just a moment, the Natufian mourners around a Levantine grave 13,000 years ago, and the Sumerian scribe writing his hymn to Ninkasi, and the Greek philosophers reclining at their symposium, and the Belgian monk stirring a copper kettle. You are joining a very long, very warm human conversation. Sleep well, and when we meet again, we will follow the story of one of the strangest and most improbable of all human industries, the harvesting, transporting, and delivering of ice, long before refrigeration existed. The Cold Empire. Until then, good night.